Welcome back. A lot of learners want to start their DevOps journeys. In the last couple of weeks, we had actually created a video on DevOps roadmap, and in this video, also we will be focusing on DevOps roadmap again. What are the things you can do to learn doc? I mean, what are the things that you can do to learn DevOps? There are hundreds of DevOps tools out there. Which one of them should you learn first, and what is the order in which you have to learn them? Do you have to learn all of them, or do you want, like, is it possible for us to pick and choose a few among them? That's the conversation we will be having with Vikram. I'm really glad to have you here.
Thank you. Thank you, Ranga. Me too.
Vikram, do you want to start with a quick introduction of yourself?
Yes. So myself, Vikram, I have overall 8 years of experience working as both developer and DevOps engineer. So currently, I'm working, for a company which is into telecom domain as a CI/CD engineer. So I mainly work with containerization tools like Docker, Kubernetes, Helm, Istio, and coming to the programming background. So I also work on automation using Python and Golang. And I
Awesome.
also work on the other tools like the Jenkins, Ansible, Terraform. So I usually cover all the tools. But coming to the core part, I majorly work on the containerization tools.
Perfect, awesome. Right, so you have a lot of experience with playing with containers and container orchestration.
Yes,
Right, so
exactly.
let's probably start with a high level overview of your journey. Right, how was your
Mhm.
learning journey towards DevOps? Where did you start,
Mhm.
and what are the different things that you have learned as part of your journey, and what are the things that you have learned as part of your journey?
Sure. So actually, in these 8 years of experience, for the first 5 years, I was working as a Python and embedded C developer, and then slowly I thought of moving into cloud. And at the same time, I also wanted to work on this deployment part. Whatever things related to hosting a site or hosting a application, something like that. So during
Hmm.
that course of my journey, so I had this requirement of working on Docker and Kubernetes. So then
Okay.
that's my first steps into this DevOps and cloud. So I started learning Docker. So initially I had a lot of issues understanding Docker because that was the first time even I
Right.
started working on Linux platform. So earlier it was all on Windows using the IDEs required for that programming language, right? For Python we
Right.
have an IDE, for embedded C we have an IDE, but I never really worked on the terminals. Okay. So but if you want to learn Docker, you have the Docker desktop where from the GUI you can start the containers. But when I started Docker, right, so there was no this much sophisticated GUI, which is Docker desktop. They had the Docker desktop, but from the Docker desktop you could never see the running containers. You cannot stop or start them
Right.
directly from the GUI, right.
Right.
So
Right.
but working on the command line was okay for me. But when I switched to this Linux platform, right, there was no GUI, so everything is
Mm.
a service, a daemon running in the background, right.
Right.
So that was my first step towards DevOps, learning Docker and Linux together.
Okay.
Okay, so and in Docker I learned a lot of things, and the requirement was for the Java based applications. So
Mm.
I had to learn about Maven. So I had to learn about what is this POM file, what are these
Right.
repositories. So internally we were hosting Nexus repository. So I had to know a bit about the repositories. How your container can pull, not the container, but your Maven, right? Your Maven should pull the dependencies, how to push your
Exactly.
dependencies. So I started with Docker, but as the requirements kept growing, so I had to explore other tools as well. But the Nexus
Absolutely.
was the next tool, and in
Okay.
order to work with Nexus and this Maven, right, so obviously you should know Maven, right?
Right.
Without knowing Maven, without knowing what is POM, without knowing the distribution management, what are mirror
Right.
servers, what is a hosted repository, proxy repository. So I had to
Right.
learn all these things, right? So when I started learning them, right, so I felt like I'm learning both DevOps and cloud, because in one side I'm learning about accessing application, creating users roles, creating user tokens to access them. At the same time I'm also learning Docker, writing
Mm.
multi-stage builds for building Java based applications. So it was like
Okay.
I'm learning both at the same time.
Awesome.
right? So this is
Yeah.
how I started my
And
DevOps journey.
I think one interesting point you're bringing up is like you have learned cloud and DevOps together, right? So I think
Yes,
that's good, especially because I think today cloud is the best place to start learning DevOps. Is that your opinion too? Because I feel like typically if you don't use the cloud and if you want to learn DevOps, there is a lot of setup which is involved, right? But
yes,
if you are
correct.
using the cloud, you can just focus on the DevOps concepts and not really about the infrastructure and things like that.
Correct. Even I myself had a Windows laptop which was not pro version. So I had
Hmm.
hard time setting up the Docker environment itself. So I had to create a virtual box and then install a VM and then Docker on it. So,
Okay.
setting up even multi-node, cluster for the Kubernetes was a difficult task for me. So what I did is I started learning some of the services in, AWS, right?
Hmm.
So I can spin up multiple VMs and then create my clusters. You can host anything there. So instead of practicing locally, so if I practice on cloud, so at the same time I'm learning two things, right? So that
Absolutely.
is why I
Absolutely.
shifted from on-prem, like practicing on my local machine, to cloud.
Yeah, I think that's like so. Yeah, I think you explained about your journey towards Docker. You explained your journey about journey
Yes.
towards cloud, right? So, where did the Kubernetes come into picture? When did you start learning Kubernetes, and how did it happen?
Yes, so Kubernetes. So internally, we were using Docker Swarm for for our cluster requirements. Since we
Okay,
cannot host our application on one node, so at that time when I started Docker, right? So Kubernetes was not that, it was popular, but we never had any experts internally to the organization who could set up a cluster and write the YAML files required for deployment of the applications, right? So we were relying on Docker Swarm. But
okay,
then what we thought is, even in the internal we are not using any private cloud, so we have our data center where we are running all this stuff. Then what we decided is we have to move to Azure Kubernetes service, right?
okay.
For that Kubernetes is needed. So
Yeah.
and so from that time onwards I started going through Kubernetes. So yeah, so that's how this Kubernetes journey started in my case.
Okay,
So
okay.
it's a requirement.
Awesome. Did you have any experience with other DevOps tools like Terraform or like infrastructure
Terraform,
code related
I
things?
never had chance to work on Terraform because
Okay,
mostly I
okay,
was working on on-prem data centers, so infrastructure was already there. Yeah, so
okay.
Terraform I never, really never worked on it.
Okay, okay, cool, awesome. So, if somebody is starting their journey today, right? So you have went through this journey. Let's say somebody is starting
Yes.
this journey today, right?
Okay.
Somebody like is new to DevOps. Maybe they have some programming experience. Maybe they don't have programming experience. So,
Yes.
what would be the best place you would want to advise? Like one of the important things, Vikram, like is for me, like whenever I want to call something a
Hmm.
roadmap should not be more than 4 steps. So what
True.
would be the 4 steps that somebody can take, like what would be the first 4 steps that somebody can take to start learning DevOps?
So the first thing which I say is they have to know about Linux, basic
Okay,
Linux commands. How
okay,
to, there are certain concepts in Linux, right? How to SSH. There is a passwordless authentication.
right,
So those things they have to know in depth,
okay.
right? So first thing
So
is they
that's
have to
number
know
one.
how to work with terminals, how to run,
Right,
write the cron jobs, what is systemd, what are service files, how to create a service file. Those things they have to know for sure. If
okay, okay,
they also have to know NFS if that is required, because we
cool.
have to work on stateful applications where maintaining state is important, right?
Yeah,
And after that, what I generally feel is they have to know about Git.
okay,
Okay, because they have to version control their Docker files, their Docker compose files. They cannot store all those source files in their local machine, right? So
you're right.
I would say they have to at least spend minimum 30 days of time mastering Linux and Git.
Okay,
And then I can suggest them to go for Docker. And
okay,
in the process, so depending upon the requirements of their application, so if their application runs on Java, so they have to know about Java related tools. If it is a Python, So if they are already in Python, that is well and good. Then
Hmm.
I highly suggest them to work on Docker files. So there are many, the Docker file, there are a lot of steps, right? There are a lot of
Right.
commands. Even you have multi-stage builds, you have on-build
Hmm.
instructions, right?
Absolutely.
So writing Docker file is easy, but writing a Docker file that creates a minimal image, right? So that's difficult. So that comes out of practice.
Absolutely. Creating
Okay,
efficient
so
Docker images
yeah,
is not easy.
yeah, and then they
And
have
creating
to.
secure Docker images is not easy as well.
Yes, yes. So there are distroless images, there are alpine images where you don't have any
Absolutely.
debugging utilities. So this comes out of practice, right? So
Absolutely.
once they
Absolutely. So,
mastered, yes, please.
yeah, yeah, no, like I was just trying to summarize. So basically, you start with
Yeah,
Linux, then you would go and explore a little bit of Git, and then you would
yes,
jump into Docker. So, what's the
correct.
last step?
So the last step would be, I really feel it's CI/CD.
Okay.
Because why I'm saying CI/CD is you have to start integrating various things. You have to start
Absolutely.
integrating Git. You have to
Yeah.
start deploying your applications. You have to, start containerizing your applications by using a build server, right? I can directly go to Kubernetes from Docker, but I don't think that's the good choice. Why I'm saying
Okay.
Jenkins is you can automate anything, right?
Okay.
So you
Okay.
can push your
So,
Docker file. Yeah.
Vikram, I mean, I'm playing devil's advocate here, right? So, do you think if somebody wants to learn Docker, like we started with Linux, right? Instead of that, let's say I advise them to start with learning the cloud, because
Mhm.
if they start with learning the cloud, like probably they can create a Linux VM and play with Linux commands, and they
Yes.
can probably also like start exploring further about Git, because each of the cloud platforms have their
Mm.
own source control repository, which is similar to Git.
Yes.
They can play with
Yes.
that. And they could
Correct.
also set up continuous integration, continuous deployment, for example,
Mhm.
with, let's say, some kind of similar thing, not Jenkins, because Jenkins is, like, I would say, a lot too complicated compared to a lot of CI/CD things that you can do in the cloud, right? So,
Mhm.
because with Jenkins, you need to worry about infrastructure, you need to worry about setting the server. Like, if you talk about things like code pipeline or code build, or if you talk
Yes.
about Azure DevOps, for example, right? So those are much easier tools to get started. Is that, I mean, is that a is that
See,
something you would consider? Any things that you would see
so
against that?
when I started about my my DevOps journey, I did everything the hard way. Okay,
Mhm.
so I did everything in my local machine. Okay, I
Right.
never spinned up an EC2 instance, learned Linux over there, or installed Git utility, and I never did all those things. Maybe starting with cloud may be a good idea, but in my case, so I learned everything the hard way. So I know
Right.
what are the challenges which I faced,
Right.
right? So this is how I prefer. So I prefer
Okay.
creating my local environment. Okay, if I have to do a POC, if I have a doubt, so immediately I can run few commands, I can spin a container, do any stuff. So I prefer to have my own local environment up and running all the time. So
Okay.
whatever you are saying, that is also good. Okay, they can start with cloud, probably the minimum services like the IAM and then EC2. Then
Right.
if they can work on the Linux commands, whatever you are saying is also true. But this is how I started.
Yeah.
Right.
So, I mean, I'm like, obviously, right? So, if you would want to become an expert at anything, probably if you might not have access to cloud at a later point in time, you'd want to be able to run
Yes.
it on local. But for
Yes.
me, like, the trouble with local is there is a lot of setup involved. So, as a
Mm.
beginner, it might be easier to start on the cloud. And then as I gain expertise, probably shift more towards the local. So, I see, I mean, I see the value of local, right? So, you need to be
Yeah.
good at that. But I was thinking, like, rather than like, yeah, it's like more the contrarian approach. Like, people typically start on their local and go to the cloud. But
Correct.
today I think cloud is so popular. Cloud is going, I mean, 5 years later, I would say almost everybody has to learn the cloud. Like, it's, I
True.
doubt if there would be anybody in the IT who would not know the cloud at all. So given that is the case, why not start with that as the fundamental and kind of reverse engineer, right? That's just a thought, I
Yeah.
think.
That is
Yeah, I
also
think
there.
I Yeah, absolutely. Cool. So, like, so we would, okay. So once probably they are familiar with that, right? So let's say I know how to build a Docker image. and let's say I know how to probably like in the CI/CD, probably what I might do is probably like build a Docker image and push it to a container repository, right? So that's
Yes.
what probably we would do, right? So yeah, what's the next steps? Like we have four done. So what would be the other tools that you would recommend for somebody to get started with?
So the last thing would be container orchestration. So we have
Okay,
Docker Swarm. So that won't
okay,
take much time to learn. But when you're going for Kubernetes, there are a lot of things involved, right? So there are
right,
deployments, deployment strategies. You have stateful applications. You have
right,
config map, secrets, vault.
right,
There are a lot of things. Even coming to the administration, you have the RBAC. You should also know how to create CSRs,
right,
certificates, access control. And once you are familiar with Kubernetes, since you cannot directly deploy a lot of YAML files using just the kubectl utility, so I highly suggest using a package manager like Helm, which I
hell,
use
yeah,
in and out. So then Helm would be the next choice, right?
okay, okay,
And then if I have to consider moving forward in the same domain, so I would highly suggest go for Istio.
okay.
Yeah.
Okay. But those would be something which I would fit into the Kubernetes domain, right? So once I
Kubernetes
learned
domain, correct.
Kubernetes, once I start with
Yes,
Kubernetes, I deploy a few
it's
applications there.
completely
Then
Kubernetes.
exactly. Then I would
Kubernetes,
need to
Helm, Istio, and the rest
right.
of the stuff.
So basically, you need to worry about like with Kubernetes, you cannot continue using commands to run it in production. You have to go for declarative
Exactly.
configuration, and the
Yes.
declarative configuration is duplicated across multiple applications. You don't want that. That's where you go for Helm,
Yeah.
and
Correct.
like you have multiple microservices. All the common features probably go to your Istio, right? So that's
Yes.
awesome. So and then probably you would also get into kind of monitoring, right? So from your Kubernetes
Yeah.
clusters, probably logs and things, you can
True.
start. Uh,
You can
okay,
have
cool,
ELK,
cool.
EFK. Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. So yeah, that's wonderful, Vikram. So basically, somebody starts with, let's say, if I have to remodify it to the cloud. So somebody starts with the cloud, creates a EC2 instance, plays with a list of like commands.
Yes.
Probably like on his local machine, he'll play with Docker. Or actually, I forgot one thing in between. He'll start playing with Git. Like he'll
Yes.
understand Git committing code and all that stuff, and
Yes.
then Docker, like create a few containers for his application, and probably like he can go to a cloud service and deploy them to just play with
Yeah.
them. Probably one of the
So what
like
I
that's a good
highly
option as
suggest
well, right?
is, so we have to do everything parallelly. So once you know how to do it on-prem or locally, so you should find a similar service. So how you can do the same in cloud, right? If
Yeah,
I'm deploying my container locally, so I should know of a service which does the same thing in cloud, like you have the
absolutely.
ECS. So you have
Yeah,
to, it
or
won't take
to keep
much
it in
time, right?
particular, probably Elastic Beanstalk.
Yes. So it won't take much time once you know how to work on-prem, like when you're doing
Yeah,
it locally. So it's the same thing, right?
exactly,
It's only the
exactly.
configuration over there.
Exactly. Exactly. Absolutely. So, and then probably like things like Kubernetes is where I worry about local because setting up a
That's
Kubernetes
really
cluster on the cloud is like a click of couple of buttons. But if I have to set
true.
it up on my local machine, it's like, and also, I mean, one of the biggest advantages is that like people can create one free account for AWS, one free account for Azure, one free account for Google Cloud, and they
True.
can play with
Yes.
Kubernetes on all the
Yes.
three, right? So that option also
Correct.
they have.
Yeah. But for
Awesome. Awesome.
Kubernetes, I highly suggest setting up an environment locally. So there are multiple
Okay.
ways. You know of a kubeadm way, which is pretty hard,
Right.
but you will understand what exactly you're doing. There is Minikube, which is very easy,
Right.
but they'll also
Right.
give you inbuilt, the load balancer service type called Metal LB. So they
Right.
have the storage class. They are all the plugins inbuilt. So I highly suggest setting up the environment locally, because this is
Yeah.
where most of the issues come, right?
Okay. Okay. But
So, and then I would
Vikram, I mean,
suggest
just
going
to
through.
play the devil's advocate there, right? So if 5 years down the line,
Hmm.
almost everybody is going to use EKS or AKS or like GKE. What's the use of learning how to set up a cluster like on your local machine? Like what
See
would
if you.
I mean, let me take that further, right? So it's like, let's say, like I'm not an administrator. Let's say I'm a developer. Like I'm a DevOps
Hmm.
guy. I'm a developer. Like I'm a developer. Right? I'm not
Yes.
really worried about how the Kubernetes cluster is installed. I'm more worried about probably how to deploy my application to Kubernetes. What is declarative configuration? How
Hmm.
to use Istio? How to
Hmm.
use Helm? Like my focus might not be the availability of the cluster. right? I mean,
Yeah,
my focus might not be the scaling of the cluster.
true. So if you are from a developer background, you should not worry about, you shouldn't be worrying about setting up a cluster, how your cluster is set up, what are the resources. So you only worry about, you have a declarative, description of your complete application. So
Right.
whatever is the storage requirements, whatever are the resources requirements, you just put in a
Absolutely.
file. But we also
Right.
have GitOps to completely eliminate this thing, right? So where
Right.
developer, he doesn't have to worry about how the infrastructure looks like. So all he cares about your declarative files, that he has to make sure that they are updated in Git, and so the agents can pull those configurations, and within seconds his application is live and updated, right?
Absolutely.
So we are
Absolutely.
talking about the administration point of view. So even if he is
Right.
developer, so if he has time, right, so I highly suggest, he should set up a cluster from scratch. So he has to know basics about Kubernetes cluster, setting
Okay.
it up,
Okay.
various tools.
Okay. So
Yeah.
I think we are coming from two different angles. I think I'm coming from more of a development background and I'm looking at
Yes.
Kubernetes like a tool I make use of. And you are coming more
Mhm.
from an operations side and you have maybe faced a lot of challenges there, which you think everybody should understand. I think that's
Yes.
kind of the conversation that we have been having for the last few minutes, I guess.
True, because I like giving demos to people, like even to my colleagues, right? So for
Right.
giving the demo, I should know what I'm giving. So I should have the cluster up and running, right? If
Exactly.
I'm giving the
Exactly.
demo of the stateful applications, I should know how to create storage classes, PVCs. If
Yeah.
that is
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
working in my local, so I won't be able to give the demo, right? So I had a
Yeah.
lot of issues setting up the
No, no,
environment in
I
this.
can understand.
Yeah,
No, no, I can
that's why.
completely understand. Setting up a Kubernetes cluster on the local is a big, big mess.
Yes.
I would rather say it this way, right? So I mean, the complexities involved in setting up a local Kubernetes cluster are
Hmm.
pretty high.
Yes.
And that's why I kind of don't want beginners to struggle on things which they might face a lot of difficulties with, especially if their job might not be directly related to that, unless
Yeah,
it's an operations team.
maybe.
If his job is to
Yes.
maintain a Kubernetes cluster, then
Mm-hmm.
obviously, right? I mean, that's the most important part.
Yes.
But I guess, yeah, I think that's a nice discussion to have. So, Vikram, I mean, it was a lovely discussion to have with you on like how somebody can chart their journey towards DevOps. Any final
Yes.
words that you'd want to leave the audience with?
Yeah, so only one thing is, whatever you are learning, right? You should not blindly trust the resource. Like if you're seeing a blog and they have just given you outputs, like if they ran just kubectl get pods and you got list of pods. You should not believe that output. You should have a cluster up and running, either it's in your local or it's in your cloud. You should run that command, see that output
Absolutely.
yourself. So
Yeah,
otherwise there is no point in learning any of the DevOps tools, right? So
absolutely.
when things are working, it is, you feel very happy. But when things break, right, so that is where the real challenge comes. So debugging is the real challenge. So they highly
Absolutely.
suggest to get a lot of hands on whatever DevOps tool that you start with. So that's my only
Absolutely.
suggestion.
No, no, I think perfect. Like being hands on is the best way to learn technology, right? I mean,
Yes.
today, like there are opportunities to be hands on. Like being hands on is much simpler today than a few years back, right? Earlier, like
Really.
it was
Yeah.
not like really, really. I mean, with the emergence of cloud, with the emergence of like things like even on Kubernetes IO site, I can actually go and launch up a simple cluster right then, there and play with
Yes.
it, right? I mean, that kind of
Correct.
uh, like things
Yes.
were not possible a while back. So definitely, I think get
True.
hands on, like practice, and the best learning happens when you are debugging problems, right? It's not
Yes.
going to happen when you watch a presentation or when you watch a demo. It happens when you get your hands dirty, you play with it, you face problems, you then reinforce your fundamentals, find out why it's not working, and then you would
True.
actually be actually learning a lot of things. Thanks a lot,
Yes.
Vikram. Glad to have you here.
Yeah. Thank you so much for hosting me, Ranga. Thank you.